There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around without ever questioning it. It involves a misunderstood conflict, soldiers who were failed by their government, and a public that turned against a war it no longer believed in. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters, because it treats the war as something that was simply mishandled rather than something that was systematically misrepresented from the very beginning, at every level, by nearly everyone with authority over it. The gap between what happened in Vietnam and what was reported, recorded, and remembered is not a gap created by the fog of war. It was manufactured. It was institutional. And understanding that distinction changes almost everything about how the war looks when you examine it closely. The war did not begin in confusion. It began with a very clear set of claims about what it was, what it would accomplish, and how long it would take. Those claims were wrong in ways that the people making them already knew, or should have known, at the time they made them. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the event used to authorize full American military involvement, involved one confirmed attack on American naval vessels and one that almost certainly never happened. The second attack, reported on August 4, 1964, was described by the commander on the scene as doubtful at the time he reported it. His doubts were not passed along to the president. What was passed along was a version of events that justified escalation. Lyndon Johnson received the report he needed and signed the resolution that gave him authority to wage war without a formal declaration of Congress. Years later, the recorded phone calls from that period revealed that Johnson himself had privately acknowledged uncertainty about whether the second attack had occurred. He authorized a war on the basis of an event he was not sure had happened. That pattern of decision-makers receiving the information they needed rather than the information that existed would define the entire conflict. It was not a single failure. It was the operating logic of the war. By 1965, American combat troops were on the ground in significant numbers. The logic of their deployment was based on a theory called graduated escalation. The idea that steady, measured increases in military pressure would eventually convince North Vietnam to negotiate. The theory had been developed in academic and policy circles, and it had a kind of elegant rationality to it on paper. In practice, it produced something entirely different. Because escalation was gradual, the North Vietnamese had time to adapt after each increase in American force. Because the goal was to change enemy behavior through pressure rather than to destroy enemy capacity, there was always another level of pressure to apply. The war became, almost immediately, a process without a defined endpoint. Victory was not defined. Success was not defined. The conditions under which American troops could leave were never clearly established. This was not a secret. Senior military officers raised these concerns in memoranda that circulated within the Department of Defense. Those memoranda were filed. The escalation continued. The soldiers who arrived in Vietnam in the mid-1960s entered a war that their commanding officers could not explain in concrete terms. They were told they were there to stop communism. They were told they were protecting South Vietnam. They were told they were winning. All three of those statements required a level of abstraction that did not translate easily to the experience of moving through jungle terrain, taking fire from an enemy that could not be reliably distinguished from the civilian population, and then returning to base to learn that the operation had been a success. What success meant in those terms was rarely specified. The metric that came to define success in Vietnam was the body count. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential and destructive measurement systems ever applied to a military conflict. The logic behind it was simple. If the goal was to attrit the enemy's ability to fight, then the number of enemy killed was a direct measure of progress toward that goal. It was quantifiable. It could be reported up the chain of command. It could be tabulated and trended and used to demonstrate that the war was going in the right direction. It became the primary currency of military success in Vietnam, and that decision shaped the behavior of everyone involved in ways that took years to fully understand. The problem with body count as a metric was not just that it was often inaccurate, though it was. The problem was that it created incentives that systematically distorted the war. Units that produced high body counts received commendations. Officers who reported high body counts advanced. The pressure to produce numbers flowed from Washington through MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, through corps and division and brigade and battalion, down to the soldiers doing the actual fighting. And at every level, the numbers were adjusted. Not always dramatically, not always consciously, but consistently in the direction of more enemy killed. The phrase, "If it's dead and Vietnamese, it's Viet Cong," circulated among American troops not as a joke, but as a description of actual practice. Anyone killed in a free fire zone was counted as an enemy combatant. Anyone found dead in the vicinity of a weapons cache was counted as an enemy combatant. Anyone whose body could not be identified was counted as an enemy combatant. The cumulative effect of those counting practices over years of conflict produced numbers that bore a deteriorating relationship to reality. MACV reported enemy killed in action figures that, by the midpoint of the war, implied casualty rates that should have been militarily unsustainable. American analysts, including some within the intelligence community, began to note that if the reported body counts were accurate, the enemy should not have been able to continue operating at its observed level of activity. The numbers did not add up. This was raised internally. The official response was to question the analysis rather than the numbers. The most significant collision over this question occurred in 1967, when Sam Adams, a CIA analyst, developed an estimate of enemy troop strength that was substantially higher than the figures being used in official reporting. Adams concluded that MACV was undercounting enemy forces by at least a factor of 2, possibly more, by excluding certain categories of irregular fighters and militia from the official order of battle. His estimates were reviewed, challenged, revised downward through a process that was less analytical than political, and ultimately suppressed in favor of figures that supported the official narrative that the war was being won. The controversy eventually became the subject of a lawsuit decades later after a CBS documentary raised the same questions. But in 1967, the suppressed estimates had a direct consequence. The American military and intelligence establishment went into the Tet Offensive of January 1968 with a picture of enemy strength that was fundamentally wrong. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of attacks launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces against more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including a strike on the American embassy compound in Saigon. It was militarily costly for the attackers. By the conventional measures being applied at the time, it was a defeat for the communist forces. They did not hold the cities they attacked. They suffered enormous casualties. But the offensive had not been aimed primarily at military objectives. It had been aimed at psychological ones, and on that level, it succeeded in ways that fundamentally altered the war. The American public had been told, repeatedly and with apparent confidence, that the enemy was weakening, that the war was progressing, that the light at the end of the tunnel was visible. The Tet Offensive made those claims impossible to sustain. Not because the offensive proved American military failure, but because its scale made the previous reassurances look like fabrications. Walter Cronkite traveled to Vietnam in the aftermath of Tet and returned to tell his television audience that the war appeared to be a stalemate. Lyndon Johnson reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost the country. Within 2 months, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The political framework that had sustained the escalation collapsed not because the war was going badly in military terms, but because the gap between the official version and the observed reality had finally become too wide to paper over. What happened after Tet was not a reassessment. It was a rebranding. The strategy shifted, at least nominally, toward Vietnamization. The process of building up South Vietnamese forces to take over combat responsibilities from American troops. The language changed, the metrics shifted somewhat, but the underlying dynamic remained. The war continued, the reports continued, the gap between official claims and ground reality continued. The Phoenix program, launched in 1968 and operating through the early 1970s, was designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure in South Vietnam by targeting its civilian components. the political organizers, the tax collectors, the village-level administrators who made the insurgency function. The program combined intelligence gathering, capture, defection incentives, and assassination. It was, in conception, a recognition that the war could not be won purely by killing fighters, that the political and administrative network sustaining the insurgency needed to be dismantled. In practice, it became something considerably more complicated. Phoenix operated through a system of provincial and district-level offices staffed by a combination of American advisors, South Vietnamese officials, and intelligence personnel from multiple agencies. The program produced neutralization statistics, numbers representing enemy infrastructure personnel who had been captured, killed, or induced to defect. By 1971, official figures claimed that Phoenix had neutralized more than 20,000 members of the Viet Cong infrastructure annually. Those numbers were reported to Congress as evidence that the program was working. The reality of how those numbers were generated was documented in testimony by program participants years later. Neutralization quotas were assigned to provincial and district teams, numerical targets they were expected to meet each month. When actual Viet Cong infrastructure members could not be identified and captured or induced to defect, the quotas were met by other means. Political opponents of local South Vietnamese officials were reported as Viet Cong infrastructure. Personal enemies were reported. People with land that local officials wanted were reported. The program created, at the local level, a mechanism for turning the American war effort into a tool for settling private scores, with the neutralization statistics traveling upward through the chain of command and appearing in reports to Congress as evidence of success. The Senate testimony of William Colby, who ran the program and later became director of the CIA, acknowledged that abuses had occurred but framed them as exceptions rather than structural features. The program participants who testified to the contrary, men who described torture, arbitrary killing, and the systematic inflation of statistics, were less prominently heard. The official record of Phoenix is the one Colby largely shaped. The alternative record exists in declassified documents, in congressional testimony that received limited attention, and in the accounts of veterans who have spoken about what they witnessed. The role of civilian casualties in the Vietnam War occupied a similarly complex position in the official record. The rules of engagement governing American military operations in Vietnam were formally quite restrictive. Civilian casualties were to be minimized. Populated areas were to be treated with specific caution. The formal rules, reviewed and updated throughout the war, reflected a genuine awareness at the policy level that civilian harm undermined the political objectives the military was supposed to be serving. The formal rules and the operational reality maintained a consistent distance from each other. Free fire zones, officially designated specified strike zones, were areas in which anyone present was presumed to be hostile and could be engaged without prior clearance. The designation of these zones expanded over the course of the war, particularly in areas where the Viet Cong had established strong local presence. The practical effect was to remove civilian protection in precisely the areas where the insurgency was most deeply embedded in the population, which was to say, the areas where the distinction between combatant and civilian was most difficult to maintain and most important to try to maintain. Arc Light missions, the B-52 carpet bombing operations, were conducted with limited ability to distinguish between military and civilian targets in areas where those targets occupied the same geographic space. The strategic bombing of North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder and its successors, caused civilian casualties that were acknowledged in targeting assessments and then accepted as within permissible bounds. The accounting of civilian deaths was conducted by the same institutional apparatus that was inflating enemy combatant deaths, and with similar results in terms of accuracy. The massacre at My Lai in March 1968 became, eventually, the most documented instance of deliberate mass civilian killing in the American War. A unit of the American Division entered the village of My Lai and killed between 300 and 500 civilians over several hours. There was no firefight. There was no enemy resistance. The victims were unarmed men, women and children, including infants. The operation was reported up the chain of command as a successful engagement against Viet Cong forces, with significant enemy killed in action. No one in the reporting chain raised questions about the absence of American casualties, the absence of captured weapons, or the specific circumstances of the operation. The massacre was concealed for more than a year. The soldier who ultimately brought it to wider attention, Ron Ridenour, was not a witness but had heard accounts from soldiers who were there. His letters to the Department of Defense and members of Congress prompted an investigation that the Army had not conducted on its own. The subsequent trials resulted in the conviction of only one person, Lieutenant William Calley, and his sentence was reduced and then commuted. The investigators who documented the cover-up identified a chain of institutional failure running from the soldiers on the ground through multiple levels of command. The cover-up was not the act of a few individuals protecting themselves. It was the response of an institution that had created the conditions for the massacre and then could not acknowledge what those conditions had produced. What My Lai documented was not an aberration. It was a pattern made visible. The conditions that produced it, the dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians, the pressure to produce body counts, the absence of accountability for civilian deaths, the normalization of violence against a population that could not be reliably divided into friend and enemy, had been present since the beginning of the war and would remain present after Calley's conviction. The framing that emerged from the trial of a few bad actors in an otherwise sound institutional structure served to contain the implications rather than examine them. The psychological damage inflicted on the men who fought in Vietnam accumulated in ways that the military medical establishment was poorly equipped to recognize or address. The Army's approach to combat stress in Vietnam was shaped partly by experience from earlier wars and partly by the specific demands of an advisory and counterinsurgency mission that did not fit conventional medical categories. Soldiers served one-year tours, rotating in and out of combat individually rather than as units. This meant that the social cohesion that had historically provided psychological protection in combat, the bonds between men who had trained and fought together for extended periods, was structurally undermined from the start. A soldier could be a short timer, counting down the days to his rotation date, while the men around him were at various stages of their own individual tours. The war did not end for a unit. It ended for individuals, one at a time, while the unit continued. The consequences of this structure for morale and cohesion were recognized by military sociologists and medical officers in real time. Studies conducted in-country documented declining unit cohesion, rising drug use, and increasing incidents of what were called combat refusals, instances where soldiers declined to execute orders to advance on positions they believed to be suicidal or pointless. The rate of combat refusals increased substantially in the late 1960s and early 1970s as the overall direction of the war shifted and as the sense that the fighting was purposeful diminished. These incidents were documented in unit records and then, in many cases, handled informally to avoid generating paperwork that would reflect badly on the chain of command. The drug problem in Vietnam was, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, severe enough to constitute a crisis of military capability. Heroin, available cheaply and in high purity in Vietnam, had become widespread among American troops in a way that had no precedent in American military history. Studies conducted by the Department of Defense found heroin use rates among Vietnam veterans that were staggering by any measure. A 1971 study found that approximately 20% of enlisted men in Vietnam had used heroin, and a significant portion of those were physically dependent. The military's initial response was to handle the problem administratively, treating drug use as a disciplinary issue rather than a medical one, which predictably did not reduce the problem. The decision to publicly acknowledge the scale of the drug problem came with political costs that the Nixon administration was reluctant to pay, since a military riven by drug dependency was not compatible with the narrative of effective Vietnamization and honorable withdrawal. The internal documents on this subject, which became available through later declassification, show an institution that understood the scope of the problem and spent considerable energy managing its public dimensions rather than its actual dimensions. Fragging, the killing or attempted killing of American officers and non-commissioned officers by their own subordinates, most commonly with fragmentation grenades, increased steadily through the late 1960s and reached a peak in the early 1970s. The Army documented hundreds of confirmed or suspected fragging incidents, representing a form of internal violence that had no real equivalent in American military history. The fraggings were not random. They tended to be directed at officers and NCOs who were seen as recklessly endangering their men, who were enforcing unpopular standards with particular harshness, or who had broken the implicit agreements about reasonable risk that governed relations between enlisted men and junior officers in a war that many of the participants believed was unwinnable. The existence of fragging as a phenomenon was discussed in military circles and eventually in the press, but the scale of it was carefully managed in official reporting. The Army's reported figures almost certainly undercount the actual incidents because many were classified as accidents or as enemy action. The negotiating process that eventually produced the Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, had been proceeding in various forms since 1968. The talks went through multiple phases, produced multiple apparent near agreements, and collapsed repeatedly in ways that extended the war by years. The Christmas bombing campaign of December 1972, one of the most intensive bombing operations of the entire war, was conducted in the final weeks before the accords were signed. The official explanation was that it forced North Vietnam back to the table and produced the agreement. The internal record suggests a more complicated picture, in which the bombing was as much about demonstrating resolve to the South Vietnamese government, which was resisting signing an agreement it believed would ultimately lead to its destruction, as it was about extracting concessions from Hanoi. The South Vietnamese government was not wrong about its prognosis. The Paris Peace Accords created a ceasefire that neither side observed for long. The provisions of the accords were violated almost immediately by both North and South Vietnamese forces. American involvement was supposed to have ended, but American funding and logistical support for South Vietnam continued. The war did not stop. It changed form. The congressional decision in 1973 to prohibit further American military involvement in Southeast Asia, embodied in the War Powers Resolution and in specific legislation cutting off funds for combat operations, reflected a degree of institutional exhaustion with the conflict, rather than a clear strategic reassessment. The executive branch had been conducting secret bombing operations in Cambodia since 1969 without congressional authorization and with active measures taken to conceal those operations from Congress. The B-52 missions over Cambodia were logged with falsified targeting data, with the actual strike coordinates replaced by coordinates in South Vietnam, so that the officially reported record of the bombing campaign did not correspond to where the bombs had fallen. This was not a minor administrative irregularity. It was a systematic falsification of military records to conceal a military campaign from the legislative branch of the government that was supposed to be overseeing it. The secret bombing of Cambodia, Operation Menu and its successors, was conducted between 1969 and 1973 and involved thousands of sorties dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of ordnance on a country with which the United States was not formally at war. The bombing was aimed at North Vietnamese supply lines and base areas in Cambodia. Its effects on the Cambodian civilian population were devastating, and its political effects helped destabilize the Cambodian government in ways that contributed to the eventual rise of the Khmer Rouge. The full record of the bombing was not acknowledged by the United States government until the early 1970s, when leaks to the press made concealment no longer viable. The officials who had designed and implemented the falsification of records were never held criminally accountable for it. The handling of prisoners of war and missing in action personnel represented another domain in which the official record and the actual record diverged in ways that continue to generate controversy long after the war ended. The American government acknowledged a specific number of prisoners held by North Vietnam, and the return of those prisoners under the Paris Peace Accords was one of the stated objectives of the negotiations. The prisoners who came home, approximately 600 men, were publicly celebrated in a way that served specific political purposes, demonstrating that the Nixon administration had achieved an honorable end to the war by securing the return of American fighting men. The question of whether all prisoners had in fact been returned was raised during the prisoner repatriation process and then substantially suppressed. Intelligence reporting from the period suggested that at least some prisoners were being held back, that North Vietnam was using the possibility of additional repatriations as a potential future bargaining chip. This assessment, generated within the Defense Intelligence Agency and other parts of the intelligence community, did not shape the official public position, which held that all live prisoners had been returned. The families of men listed as missing in action and the advocacy organizations they formed spent years pressing the government to acknowledge the possibility that men remained alive in Southeast Asia after the official end of American involvement. The institutional response to that pressure was, for most of the 1970s and 1980s, a combination of limited acknowledgement and active discouragement. The Senate Select Committee on POW/MIA Affairs, which conducted extensive hearings in the early 1990s, produced a final report that acknowledged serious failures in the handling of intelligence about prisoners and missing personnel, including the withholding of information from families and the inadequate follow-up on credible reports of live Americans. The committee stopped short of concluding that live prisoners had been deliberately abandoned, but the record it produced documented an institutional pattern of managing the issue rather than resolving it. The chemical herbicide program in Vietnam, of which Agent Orange was the most significant component, involved the aerial and ground application of defoliant chemicals over millions of acres of Vietnamese jungle and agricultural land between 1962 and 1971. Operation Ranch Hand, as the aerial defoliation program was officially named, was designed to eliminate the jungle cover that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese used for concealment and to destroy crops in areas under enemy control. The tactical rationale was straightforward. The long-term consequences were not considered in the program's design because the long-term consequences of mass herbicide application were not something that had been studied in the context being created. The herbicide mixture designated Agent Orange contained dioxin as a contaminant, a byproduct of the manufacturing process. Dioxin is among the most toxic synthetic compounds known, associated with cancer, neurological damage, birth defects, and immune system disruption. The presence of dioxin in Agent Orange was known to the chemical manufacturers before the program began, and the health risks of dioxin exposure were being studied in industrial and occupational contexts during the years of the Vietnam program. That knowledge did not halt or significantly modify the program. The application of Agent Orange continued until 1971, when it was suspended, officially because of environmental concerns raised internally, not because of the established health effects on the human beings in the application zones. American veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange spent years attempting to establish the connection between their exposures and their health conditions. The Veterans Administration's initial position was that the connection had not been conclusively demonstrated, a standard of proof that functioned to deny benefits while the veterans aged and died. Class action litigation by veterans eventually produced a settlement in 1984, but the government maintained for years afterward that it had not been demonstrated that Agent Orange caused the specific health conditions veterans attributed to it. The scientific consensus that emerged over the following decades established those connections firmly. The Vietnamese civilian population exposed to Agent Orange, in numbers far exceeding the exposed American veterans, received no compensation from the United States government for decades, and the contamination of specific sites in Vietnam remained an active health issue. The withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam between 1969 and 1973 was accompanied by a continuing effort to maintain the fiction that the South Vietnamese government and military were capable of sustaining themselves without direct American combat support. Vietnamization required demonstrating South Vietnamese military competence in operations that the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, often lacked the training, the equipment, or the institutional coherence to conduct effectively. The Lam Son 719 operation in 1971, in which South Vietnamese forces attempted to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, was a significant test of Vietnamization's premise. The operation was planned with American advisors, supported by American air power, and conducted by ARVN units. It ended in a disorderly retreat that was described in American official communications as a qualified success, and in the accounts of the soldiers who participated in it as a near rout. The images from Lam Son 719, including photographs and film footage of South Vietnamese soldiers clinging to the sides of American helicopters as they evacuated, were a direct visual refutation of the Vietnamization narrative. Those images circulated in the press. The official response was to attribute the difficulties to specific tactical factors while maintaining that the overall program was proceeding successfully. The military correspondents covering the operation reported what they had seen. The official briefings reported something different. The role of American Special Operations Forces in Vietnam extended well beyond what was publicly acknowledged during the war or for years afterward. MAC-V Studies and Observations Group, known as MAC-VSOG, conducted cross-border operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam throughout the war, running reconnaissance and direct action missions that were officially denied. The personnel involved in these operations were under cover designations that concealed their actual activities from official records. Their casualties were handled through mechanisms that obscured the circumstances of death. The full record of MAC-V-SOG operations was classified at levels that prevented public accounting. Veterans of the organization could not discuss their service. The operations conducted by MAC-V-SOG included the direct capture and interrogation of North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao personnel on their own territory, the execution of intelligence assets who were believed to have been turned, and raids on facilities in countries with which the United States was not at war. The debriefs and after-action reports from these missions constitute a partial record of a war within a war that operated entirely outside the frameworks of law, policy, and public understanding that supposedly governed American military conduct. The Phoenix program was a public, if imperfectly understood, element of the overall counterinsurgency strategy. MAC-VSOG was categorically different in its relationship to any form of oversight. The intelligence community's performance throughout the Vietnam War was marked by a persistent split between what analysts assessed and what policymakers received and acted upon. The CIA produced a series of estimates over the course of the conflict that challenged the optimistic projections of MACV and of successive administrations. Those estimates were reviewed, sometimes revised under political pressure, and in key instances, suppressed in favor of more favorable assessments. The 1967 controversy over enemy troop strength was the most visible instance of this dynamic, but it was not unique. The systematic optimism of official reporting created a self-reinforcing problem. Because the metrics being reported showed progress, decisions about troop levels, operational tempo, and strategic direction were made on the basis of a picture that did not correspond to the actual situation. Resources were allocated on the basis of reported success rather than actual conditions. Operations were planned on the basis of enemy capabilities that were underestimated. The war was being fought in a kind of strategic fog, generated not by the enemy, but by the reporting systems of the American military and intelligence establishment. The soldiers on the ground understood this, in most cases, without being able to articulate it precisely. There was a term widely used in Vietnam, the 5 o'clock follies, referring to the daily briefings given to the press at MACV headquarters in Saigon. The term expressed a collective understanding that the official version of what was happening in the war bore a specific relationship to the version being experienced by the people fighting it, which was to say, a relationship characterized by consistent, systematic divergence. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam and found that their experience did not match the official narrative were not wrong about that divergence. They had been living it for a year. The handling of psychological trauma among returning veterans was an extension of the same institutional dynamic. The clinical concept that would eventually be called post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist as a diagnostic category in the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic framework until 1980, and its development was substantially driven by the advocacy of Vietnam veterans and the clinicians who worked with them. Before that diagnostic recognition, the symptoms experienced by veterans, the intrusive memories, the hyperarousal, the avoidance, the emotional numbing, were attributed to individual psychological weakness or to pre-existing conditions rather than to the specific experiences of combat and the specific moral conditions of the Vietnam War. The VA's approach to treating these conditions before and even after 1980 was shaped by institutional constraints, by the need to manage a large and growing population of veterans with limited resources, and by a bureaucratic culture that had not been designed to address the kind of damage that Vietnam had inflicted. Veterans who sought treatment were frequently told their problems were not service-connected. They were frequently given diagnoses that did not capture the nature of their experience. They were frequently processed through a system that needed them to have problems that fit existing categories rather than problems that reflected the actual nature of what they had been through. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans, elevated above comparable age groups in the general population, was not systematically tracked for years after the war. Studies that were eventually conducted suggested that the number of Vietnam veterans who died by suicide in the years following the war was comparable to or exceeded the number killed in combat. This was not information that the government sought out. It was information that emerged from research conducted under conditions of institutional resistance. The war in the air over North Vietnam was a distinct component of the conflict with its own set of institutional realities. The air campaign, of which Rolling Thunder between 1965 and 1968 was the centerpiece, was conducted under targeting restrictions that reflected political calculations rather than purely military ones. Certain categories of targets were placed off-limits by the White House, including areas near the Chinese border, port facilities that might be used by Soviet or Chinese ships, and certain urban areas. The restrictions were designed to avoid escalation to direct conflict with China or the Soviet Union, a concern that was entirely legitimate given the experience of the Korean War. But they were applied in ways that frustrated the military commanders conducting the campaign and led to the application of escalating force against a more limited target set. The bombing halts, periods during which Rolling Thunder was suspended as a signal of American willingness to negotiate, were decided at the highest levels of government on the basis of diplomatic calculations. Military commanders were not consistently included in these decisions and were sometimes not informed in advance. The restarts of the bombing after each halt produced the same target sets, struck in the same ways, generating the same outcomes. The North Vietnamese used the halts to repair damage, move supplies, and strengthen air defenses. The pattern of halt and restart continued for years. The air war over North Vietnam was also the context in which American aviators were shot down and captured in significant numbers. The treatment of those prisoners by North Vietnamese captors was brutal and documented by the prisoners themselves after their return. What received less attention was the specific tactical context that created the prisoner population in the first place. The repetitive bombing of defended targets with inadequate tactics and equipment, restricted by politically motivated targeting constraints, producing losses that experienced aviators recognized as unnecessary but were ordered to accept. The bravery of the men who flew those missions is not in question. The decisions that sent them into those missions under those conditions is a different matter. The logistical apparatus supporting the American war effort in Vietnam was itself a significant dimension of the conflict's institutional character. The base system built in Vietnam during the war years involved an investment in permanent infrastructure, in roads, ports, airfields, and facilities that was incongruous with a military effort theoretically aimed at a limited objective. The permanence of the infrastructure implied a duration of commitment that the official narrative never acknowledged. Soldiers who arrived in Vietnam were struck by the scale of the base infrastructure, the PX, the swimming pools, the elaborate dining facilities that existed alongside the visible poverty of the country they were nominally in Vietnam to defend. The contradiction was noted. Its implications were absorbed without resolution. The South Vietnamese civilian government, with which the United States was ostensibly allied, was, throughout the war, a source of complications that the official narrative consistently underplayed. South Vietnam went through a rapid succession of governments in the early 1960s, several of them brought to power through coups in which American intelligence and military personnel were implicated to varying degrees. The assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963, a coup that the Kennedy administration had signaled its approval of in advance, removed the one South Vietnamese leader who had managed to build a functioning, if repressive, governmental apparatus. What followed was a period of political instability that fundamentally undermined the rationale for American involvement. Since the United States was supposed to be supporting a viable allied government that it could now not reliably identify, the Thuy government that eventually stabilized South Vietnamese politics did so through a combination of election manipulation, suppression of political opposition, and dependence on American support that was not consistent with the picture of an independent, self-sustaining ally. The elections held in South Vietnam during the war years produced results that were managed rather than contested in any genuine sense. The political detention facilities in South Vietnam held, at various points, large numbers of individuals who were classified as political prisoners rather than combatants, a distinction that was inconvenient for the official narrative and was therefore generally not made in official communications. The economic dimension of the war created additional institutional distortions. The inflation of the South Vietnamese economy, produced by the massive influx of American dollars, American goods, and American personnel, generated a black market and a dependency that had no sustainable basis. The corruption that accompanied the economic distortion affected both the civilian government and the military. South Vietnamese officers sold positions, diverted supplies, and maintained ghost soldiers on their unit rolls, collecting pay for men who did not exist, and reducing the effective strength of units that existed primarily on paper. American advisors who documented this were sometimes discouraged from pressing the issue, because pressing it created friction with the Allied forces that the overall mission required maintaining good relations with. The relationship between American forces and the South Vietnamese population was systematically complicated by factors that the official framing of the war as a defense of South Vietnamese freedom could not accommodate. The practice of uprooting rural Vietnamese populations and relocating them to strategic hamlets, a policy adopted from British counterinsurgency practice and implemented with considerably less care than the British had applied in Malaya, generated deep resentment among people who had been removed from their ancestral lands and placed in facilities that combined the features of a refugee camp with those of a prison. The strategic hamlet program was eventually acknowledged to have failed, in part because it had created as much resistance as it had neutralized. The acknowledgement came years after the policy had run its course. The relationship between American units and Vietnamese civilians in combat areas was shaped by factors that official rules of engagement could not fully govern. The difficulty of distinguishing Viet Cong sympathizers from genuine non-combatants in a context where the insurgency was embedded in the civilian population by design and by history, produced a practical approach to civilian interaction that ranged from genuine attempts to separate fighters from non-combatants through various degrees of indifference to civilian welfare, to active aggression against civilians as an expression of frustration, racial hostility, or the logic of body count. Production. All of these modes of operation coexisted within the American military in Vietnam. The official record reflects primarily the first. The accounts of veterans and the investigations that were conducted when incidents became too visible to ignore document all three. The reporting by American journalists in Vietnam occupied an unusual position in the information environment of the war. The military provided considerable access to journalists, more than in some previous conflicts, partly because of the absence of formal censorship, and partly because the access served the purpose of generating coverage that, it was assumed, would tend to be favorable. For much of the early war, that assumption held. As the war extended and its contradictions became harder to obscure, the relationship between the military and the press deteriorated. The accusation, popular in some quarters after the war, that the press had lost Vietnam by undermining public support for the conflict through negative coverage, was an inversion of the actual causal sequence. The press began reporting the war more skeptically because the war was producing evidence of institutional failure that credible journalism could not ignore. The negative coverage was a response to what was happening, not a cause of it. The specific restriction of information flow in Vietnam extended to the handling of casualties. The transport of American dead from Vietnam was conducted under procedures that, starting in 1968, prevented news media from photographing or filming the return of remains to the United States. The restriction, which formalized practices that had already been partially in place, meant that the physical reality of American casualties, the flag-draped caskets, the bodies of specific individuals, remained largely absent from the public visual record of the war. The families of the dead experienced the return of their sons and husbands and fathers in a private process that did not intersect with the public representation of the conflict. The systematic invisibility of American dead in the public sphere was a deliberate policy choice that shaped the public's ability to gauge the human cost of the war. The anti-war movement inside the military itself was a phenomenon that received limited attention during the war and has received limited attention since. By the late 1960s, active duty soldiers and veterans were among the more prominent voices opposing the war. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, founded in 1967, organized actions including the Winter Soldier Investigation of 1971, in which over 100 veterans testified about war crimes and atrocities they had witnessed or participated in. The Winter Soldier testimony was not heavily covered by the major American media at the time. It was conducted without significant official response. The institution that had created the conditions described in the testimony was not compelled to address the substance of what was being said. The specific combination of circumstances that produced the moral erosion documented in the Winter Soldier testimony was not random and was not the product of individual character failures alone. It was the product of a training system that prepared soldiers for conventional combat in an unconventional war, of tactical doctrines that valued firepower over discrimination, of a command culture that rewarded body count production and punished those who raised questions about how the counts were generated, and of a strategic framework that gave those on the ground no coherent objective to orient their sacrifices around. Soldiers who arrived in Vietnam were not, in most cases, predisposed to commit atrocities. The conditions they encountered created incentives and pressures that produced behavior that many of them would not have predicted of themselves. The administrative processing of veterans returning from Vietnam added a specific dimension to the collective experience of the war's end. Unlike veterans of previous conflicts who had returned home on troop ships with their units over periods of weeks, Vietnam veterans returned individually on commercial aircraft and were typically in the United States within 48 hours of their last day in the war zone. The transition from combat to civilian life was abrupt, solitary, and took place in a social context that had shifted significantly during the year or more of their absence. The country they returned to had changed in ways that were disorienting, and the experience they were returning from was not something that the social environment offered many frameworks for processing. The treatment of returning veterans was not uniformly hostile, despite a narrative that is attached to this period. Studies of actual veteran experiences suggest that the image of veterans being systematically spat upon and reviled by protesters is more mythology than documented history. But the absence of recognition, the sense that what they had done and what they had seen was not something the country wanted to look at, was widely reported and widely felt. The war was ending, but it was ending without the rituals of closure that had marked the end of previous conflicts, without a clear victory, without a moment of national acknowledgement that contained and honored what had been experienced. The fall of Saigon in April 1975, 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords, was the event that formally ended the American chapter of the Vietnam War. The images from those days, the helicopters lifting from the embassy roof, the crowds at the gates, the frantic departure of the last Americans and some of their Vietnamese allies, documented the specific character of the ending without requiring commentary. The official position that the United States had achieved an honorable peace through the Accords and that the subsequent fall was the result of South Vietnamese failure rather than American miscalculation was advanced in the days and weeks that followed. It was advanced with less conviction than previous official positions on the war had been, because the images from those final days made the alternative interpretations difficult to sustain. The American military spent the years after Vietnam in an extended process of institutional reassessment that produced significant changes in doctrine, in training, in the relationship between the military and the political leadership. The lessons identified and the reforms implemented were real and substantive. The all-volunteer force that replaced the draft created a military of different social composition and different institutional culture. The development of the air-land battle doctrine provided a clearer operational framework than anything that had guided the Vietnam-era military. The Goldwater-Nichols Act reorganized the command structure in ways that addressed specific failures identified in Vietnam and in operations conducted in its immediate aftermath. What did not change, or changed less completely, was the relationship between the military's reporting systems and the truth of what those systems were measuring. The tendency to optimize for metrics rather than outcomes, to treat the production of favorable numbers as equivalent to the achievement of favorable conditions, did not disappear with the Vietnam-era commanders who had presided over its most visible manifestations. The specific conditions that made body count the dominant metric of success in Vietnam were not replicated in the same form in subsequent conflicts, but the underlying institutional dynamic that had made body count attractive in the first place, the need for quantifiable progress reports in the absence of clearly defined objectives, proved durable. The classified records of the Vietnam War that have become available through declassification processes over the decades since its end have consistently told a story that diverges from the official version in specific and documentable ways. The Pentagon Papers, the Defense Department study commissioned by Robert McNamara in 1967 and leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, established the pattern of systematic misrepresentation as a documented institutional reality rather than an allegation. The papers showed that the policymakers who had escalated the war had access to assessments that contradicted the public statements they were making. The gap between what was known inside the government and what was told to the public and to Congress was not accidental. It was deliberate. The subsequent declassification of NSA intercepts, of CIA assessments, of MACV operational reports, of diplomatic cables and of White House recordings has continued to fill in the specific details of that picture. Each tranche of declassified material has tended to confirm and elaborate the basic pattern rather than revise it. The decisions that escalated the war were made with awareness of information, suggesting those decisions were not justified by the evidence. The decisions that sustained the war after its strategic bankruptcy became apparent were made with awareness of assessments that confirmed that bankruptcy. The reporting systems were managed to produce numbers that justified continuing the existing approach rather than honestly measuring its effects. The veterans of the Vietnam War who came forward in later decades to document what they had seen and done, in memoirs, in oral histories, in testimony to various official and academic bodies, have produced a cumulative record of the war's ground-level reality that constitutes its own form of historical documentation. That record is uneven in quality and reliability, as all such records are, but it is consistent in its broad outlines with the documentary record that declassification has produced. The war as experienced by the people who fought it and by the Vietnamese population that endured it was a different war than the one described in the official communications of the period. Both wars happened on the same terrain. The official one was the one that appeared in reports. The mines and unexploded ordnance left in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia continued killing and maiming people decades after the last American combat soldier left. The United States dropped more ordnance on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia combined than had been dropped by all sides during the entire Second World War. Large portions of that ordnance did not detonate on impact. Cluster munitions, designed to scatter submunitions over wide areas, left large numbers of unexploded bomblets across the landscape of 3 countries. The people who encountered those submunitions after the war were overwhelmingly civilians, most of them children who did not know what they had found. The casualty figures from post-war unexploded ordnance in Laos alone, the most heavily bombed country in history per capita, continued accumulating at a rate of hundreds per year through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. The American funding for ordnance clearance in the region was, for decades, minimal relative to the scale of the problem created by American ordnance. The argument against larger contributions was that the connection between specific funding and specific casualties was difficult to establish with precision, which was a version of the same evidentiary standard that had been used to avoid addressing Agent Orange exposure and veteran psychological trauma. The bombs continued to be found and to detonate. The people continued to die and to lose limbs. The accounting for what the war had left behind continued to be conducted primarily by the people it had been left upon. The reconciliation process between the United States and Vietnam, which produced the normalization of diplomatic relations in 1995, was built on a foundation of mutual practical interest rather than on any shared accounting of the war's history. The Vietnamese government had its own institutional reasons to manage the public memory of the conflict in ways that served contemporary political purposes. The American government had its own reasons to focus on the forward-looking aspects of the relationship. The question of what had actually happened and who was accountable for which parts of it was handled through a combination of limited acknowledgement and strategic ambiguity that made the relationship functional without making it honest. The memorials built to commemorate the war, including the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, serve important and legitimate purposes for the people who use them. They document specific costs and specific sacrifices. They create spaces for grief and for the kind of acknowledgement that returning veterans were denied in the immediate aftermath of the war. They do not, and were not designed to, document the institutional history of how the war was conducted and sustained and misrepresented. That history lives in archives, in declassified documents, in the accounts of people whose testimony has not been assembled into the kind of public narrative that shapes collective memory. The gap between the official record and the actual record of the Vietnam War was not closed by the war's end. It was preserved, in some respects institutionalized, by the processes through which the war was remembered and commemorated. The questions that the war raised about the relationship between democratic institutions and military power, about the mechanisms through which a democratic government can commit itself to a sustained and costly undertaking on the basis of misrepresented information, about the organizational dynamics that produce systematic falsification of results, about the conditions under which ordinary people participate in extraordinary harm, were asked and then not answered in ways that would have required institutional accountability. They remain questions. The last American killed in direct action in Vietnam died in 1975. The last American prisoner acknowledged as having been held in Vietnam was returned in 1973. The The last American helicopter left Saigon on April 30th, 1975. The war that had been described as a defense of freedom had produced the result it was supposedly fighting to prevent. The institutions that had conducted it continued to function. The officials who had managed it moved on to other positions. The reports that had been written describing progress that was not occurring were filed. The numbers that had been generated to demonstrate success that was not being achieved were archived. The soldiers who had been told they were winning came home to a country that did not want to discuss whether they had been lied to, because the answer to that question had implications that the country was not prepared to follow to their conclusions. The war ended. The silence that followed it was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of an accounting that was never completed, preserved in the records of an institution that had managed its own story more carefully than it had managed the conflict the story was about, and sustained by the collective decision to remember the sacrifice without examining the decisions that had made that sacrifice necessary, and then made it meaningless, and then continued requiring it anyway, year after year, while the reports traveled up the chain of command describing a war that was being won. In 1975, after the fall of Saigon, the Mayaguez incident occurred when a Cambodian naval vessel seized an American merchant ship. President Ford ordered a military rescue operation. 41 American servicemen died in the operation. The merchant crew had already been released before the rescue assault began.